On the last episode of the Keepsake box, Antonio looked at his watch and said, "It's after 12. I had better be getting you home, little girl." I laughed and asked him if he liked little girls. He countered my laugh with a laugh of his own. I found that I liked our playful interaction. It was different. It was comfortable. I stood in front of Antonio's desk and watched as he walked around me. I turned around to face him, which positioned my back on the front of his desk. Antonio picked me up and placed me on the desk. He positioned his body between my legs and began to kiss me. It was slow and sensual. It was the type of kiss that Ken and I used to share before he became a bully. Antonio wrapped his arms around my body and hugged me tightly. He smelled amazing. I took a moment to study Antonio's face as he pulled away. I realized that he wasn't ugly, just not my typical type. Antonio was tall and thick. He wasn't fat, but more of the bulky, solid type. He was dark, with dark brown eyes. He had thick black hair with deep waves. In that moment, I could see why women were drawn to him. Antonio was confident and assertive. He didn't mind making it known that he was in charge. I liked that. Antonio lifted me off of his desk, returning me to my original position. He grabbed my hand and led me out of his office. We said goodbye to the women, and Antonio drove me home. There was never a dull moment with him. Antonio walked me to the door and kissed me in the same manner that he had in his office. He left with no attempt to come inside. In my mind, it was pretty much a given that I would see him again. It was also a given that things would go further between us. Antonio went on his way, leaving me to wonder when I would see him again. Chapter 6. I'm Not Going Anywhere. Narrated by Shandora Warren. I started spending more time at the club after that first night. Initially, it was because I was helping Antonio get his finances in order, which was certainly a task. But after a couple of weeks, I started to enjoy being there. I got to know the dancers, and they were much different from what I expected. Maybe I watched too much television, but I assumed that they were all in dire straits. In my mind, they were all lost women who came from broken homes. I assumed that they were down on their luck and looking for a way to dig themselves out of a hole. Or maybe they were dancing to support their drug habits. I imagined that they left their children alone to fend for themselves while they danced to put food on the table. I learned that reality didn't always meet expectation. Sure, some of the women were on drugs, but it wasn't at all like I imagined. Dancing wasn't a career of desperation for most of them. Some of them had full-time jobs, but they needed a little extra income. Some of them didn't really need the money, but they enjoyed the job. A couple of them had husbands that came in and enjoyed watching them dance. I was surprised by some of the stories that came out of that room. I talked to Cream and Peaches and learned quite a bit about them as well. In spite of their perceived closeness, I learned that Peaches and Cream had quite a complicated history. Their relationship wasn't exactly amicable. Through our conversations, I heard varying accounts of how Antonio came to acquire the women. I also came to understand the hierarchy and why it was so. Peaches was the first to enter the situation. She and Antonio met in high school and once enjoyed a monogamous relationship. According to Peaches, Antonio was a nobody when they met. She said that he was impressed with the idea of being with someone like her. "What do you mean, like you?" I asked. Peaches exposed me to a part of Antonio that I hadn't known existed. By her own admission, Peaches was an orphan who was shuffled around from family to family. By the time she met Antonio, she was a wild 16-year-old who knew the streets like the back of her hand. Peaches told me that she met Antonio and was attracted to his quiet confidence. Also 16, Antonio was already a juvenile delinquent in his own right. They connected over their affinity for the street life and need for stability. Peaches was gorgeous back then. Antonio was happy to have snagged the girl that all the other guys wanted. Both Peaches and Antonio sold drugs on a small scale, but a few years in, it was obvious that Antonio had awful luck with the law. That being said, Peaches felt that they needed a more legitimate business venture. Peaches said that the strip club was her idea. It was her claim that they both put in time and resources into making it work. Just as things were taking off, Antonio caught a drug charge. As a habitual offender, he was facing serious prison time. Peaches, who didn't have a record at the time, took the charge so Antonio could stay home and build their business. She was sentenced to 2 years. According to Peaches, Antonio visited regularly and sent money throughout her entire sentence. She expected that she would come home to a perfect relationship, a grateful boyfriend, and a functioning business. Instead, she came home to cream and a business that was hanging on by a thread. According to Peaches, she and Antonio weren't ever the same. Antonio had been unfaithful before. That being so, Peaches assumed that Cream would come and go, just as the others had. But years later, Cream was still around. It seemed that there was no end in sight. According to Peaches, she accepted that Cream was going to be in the picture, but she made Antonio move out. She decided that she should level the playing field by being able to see other people as well. Peaches admitted to being at the bottom of the relationship hierarchy, but since she was getting what she needed, she decided not to rock the boat. Cream, however, had a totally different account of the events. The only part of Peaches and Cream's story that matched was the fact that Peaches had taken the charge for Antonio. But that's pretty much where the points of agreement ended. According to Cream, she and Antonio were dealing long before Peaches' incarceration. In fact, she was one of the dancers that Peaches brought into the club. Cream agreed that Peaches and Antonio had met in high school. She also agreed that Peaches was once the it girl that all the guys wanted. But she insisted that Antonio wasn't ever faithful to Peaches. She seemed to find it laughable that Peaches would make such a claim. In Cream's account, Peaches had known all about her. They had even gotten into several physical altercations prior to her incarceration. When Antonio caught his charge, Peaches only agreed to take it because Antonio had something on her. Cream didn't specify what the something was, but I got the impression that whatever it was would have resulted in serious trouble for Peaches if she hadn't done what Antonio asked of her. Cream maintained that Antonio spent most of his time and money on her while Peaches was away. She said that Antonio had only visited Peaches a few times and only did enough financially to keep her quiet. After Peaches' release, she and Cream went right back to their bickering. Antonio, who grew tired of it, decided to pull rank. Cream told me that Antonio moved into a place of his own and demanded that she and Peaches accept each other. He moved them into apartments in the same complex and made them both ride around with him until they could behave like adults. I laughed at the fact that Antonio had created a childish solution to a very adult problem. Even more amusing was the fact that Peaches and Cream had both obviously agreed to his terms and conditions. Cream told me that they agreed to play nice, and things had eventually calmed down. Even with that being so, they both kept the apartments, and Antonio still chauffeured them around, mainly because they spent a lot of time being under the influence. Cream swore that she hadn't ever cared about being Antonio's girlfriend and was basically in it for what she could get. She admitted that she had only fought for Antonio to spite Peaches, who was at the top of the hierarchy at the time. The fact was, whoever was at the top would always get more than everyone else. Cream pushed Peaches down the ladder and enjoyed the perks of being at the top. That's why she hadn't felt threatened when Sharon entered the equation a few years later. Everything was working in her favor. She just had to maintain her position. Now, Sharon's entry was the part that really threw me for a loop. Cream told me that she had introduced Sharon and Antonio. That was interesting. Cream never told me how she met Sharon or why she had chosen to introduce her to Antonio. She did say that Sharon had gotten to be a bit much, which had resulted in them having a falling out. Hearing Cream's account made a couple of things easier to understand. First, Sharon disregarded the information that I gave her about Antonio's cheating because she already knew about Cream and Peaches. Actually, he was cheating on them with her. Secondly, I understood why Cream walked into the salon and bypassed Sharon. Cream was quite pleasant and usually spoke to everyone she encountered. Her account helped me to understand her behavior. They had a history, and it obviously wasn't pleasant. I began to see Sharon as less of a victim. She knew exactly who Antonio was, as did Cream. I did, however, feel a little bad for Peaches. Sure, she knew who Antonio was, but she had lost far more than she had gained. Peaches was Antonio's age and had loved him for the entire duration of her adult life. She stuck it out when he was at his worst and took a charge for him. In return, she had to watch him replace her over and over again. I once asked Peaches why she hadn't just left the whole situation. She only answered that it wasn't that easy. I never asked what that meant. I just understood that there were things that I wouldn't understand. I didn't dedicate a lot of thought to understanding it all. I did, however, put quite a bit of thought into Antonio. At the time, Antonio and I hadn't gone past the kissing stage. I was just around a lot. Hearing Cream and Peaches' accounts of their interactions with Antonio should have deterred me from wanting to go any further with him. Yet, they didn't. For some reason, I thought that things would be different with me. He treated me differently than he treated them. I saw the benefits of dealing with Antonio, and I overlooked every sign that I should have seen. Story of my life. Things changed between me and Antonio a few weeks after our first date. Antonio asked me to come to the club to assist him with some paperwork. He unlocked the door to his office and left me alone to do my business. That was our usual routine. Initially, things went as they had on every other occasion, and I had no expectation that the encounter would be any different. Boy, was I wrong. Approximately an hour into my visit, Antonio entered the office and locked the door behind him. That was unusual. Typically, Antonio would leave the door unlocked because he didn't like to arise once he was seated. If anyone knocked, he usually instructed them to enter through the unlocked door. While doing the paperwork, I usually sat behind his desk to make things easier. If Antonio ever entered, it was customary for him to sit in the chair that was placed on the other side. I stood as Antonio walked towards me, assuming that he wanted to claim his place behind his desk. Unbeknownst to me, he had other plans. Antonio placed his arms around my waist and kissed me as I stood. He and I had kissed a few times, so I wasn't expecting things to go any further. But when Antonio started to kiss my neck, I knew the experience would be different. To this day, the details are still very vivid in my mind. I tend to hold on to things that way. I was wearing a denim dress with buttons down the entire front. Antonio released each button one by one as he kissed me. It wasn't clumsy like when Ken tried to unfasten my bra. It was smooth and effortless. I could tell that Antonio knew what he was doing. He was experienced. I wasn't wearing a bra that day, which worked out perfectly for the occasion. Antonio started at my neck and worked his way down. Initially, I felt a little insecure. I'd seen the bodies of the women that Antonio was used to, and mine couldn't compete or compare. I was slim like cream, but short like peaches. Unfortunately, I didn't have either of their assets. Thinking about it now, my body was perfectly acceptable for that of an 18-year-old. My breasts were a small A cup, and my butt was of an average size. Even so, they were both perfectly proportioned for my age and stature. I had been in many adult situations, but I was technically a child just 1 year earlier. My body was fine, but my insecurities made me second-guess everything about myself. I wasn't insecure with Ken. Well, not to that degree. I guess I knew that Ken would have limited expectations. My body was typical for a girl in our age range. But Antonio was different. He was a grown man. I immediately began to experience a bit of anxiety. What if my performance wasn't up to par? What if the sex wasn't mature enough for him? All of those thoughts crossed my mind in the time it took for Antonio to move from my neck to my shoulder. My heart began to race, and I was noticeably shaking. Antonio smiled at me, displaying his perfectly straight white teeth. They were beautiful. In that moment, he was beautiful. Antonio traced my lips with his finger. I was incredibly aroused. He made me feel that he desired me. He made me feel wanted. "Just relax," said Antonio. He instructed me to sit down on the chair. I did as he requested. Antonio got onto his knees and started kissing my breasts. He caressed my back while doing so. Antonio traced my nipples with his tongue, causing them to become erect. My body reacted to his touch in a way that I hadn't ever experienced prior to that point. I had certainly been aroused by Ken, even by Ron, but the experience with Antonio was different. It was as if he knew exactly what I wanted, needed, and desired. After leaving my breast, Antonio worked his tongue down to my stomach. It was very sensual, and my body responded appropriately. I thought he would stop there, but he didn't. Antonio continued to work his way down, exploring parts of my body that hadn't ever been touched by a tongue. Keep in mind that I was 18. Present day, oral sex is almost a given. But at 18, most of the guys that were in my age range treated oral sex like a germ, like it was nasty. But Antonio seemed to enjoy it. Antonio started by kissing the exterior while caressing the outsides of my legs. He licked in a gentle up and down motion. I tried to control the moaning, a task that was becoming increasingly difficult with every second that passed. Antonio pushed my legs up, causing my knees to come to rest on my breasts. While initially soft and sensual, Antonio began to eat with ravenous ferocity. He inserted his tongue and began a rapid sequence of in and out motions. All attempts to control the moaning had become futile at that point. I locked my legs around his head and grabbed the sides of the chair, and there it was, my first official orgasm. The accidental O was a notable point in time that always stuck with me. But the situation with Antonio was different. That was no accident. Antonio was very skilled in that department, and he knew it. He looked up at me as I reached my climax. He smiled and came up to kiss me. The thought of that would normally have been enough to disgust me, but I was intrigued. I was incredibly turned on. Antonio smiled at me. He got back onto his knees and started all over. And just like that, one orgasm became two. Antonio asked me to stand. I did as he asked. He kissed me as he buttoned my dress. He jokingly advised that we had done enough work for the night. We both laughed. Antonio didn't attempt to have sex with me, and I loved that. There was something incredibly sexy about the idea of a man who wanted to please me without having the expectation of getting anything in return. That was the night that most of my consideration for the other trio of women went out of the window. Their roles in the equation became far less important. It was official. I was there, and I wasn't going anywhere. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shenny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in purchasing books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.